A common misconception about armed conflict is anything goes when engaged in combat. This is simply not true. The four fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, or IHL, military necessity, limiting unnecessary suffering, proportionality, and distinction, work together as interdependent and reinforcing parts of a single system. Military necessity justifies a certain level of lawful violence as necessary to defeat the enemy as quickly and efficiently as possible. Conversely, the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering forbids causing suffering that is unnecessary to achieve a military objective. The principle of proportionality requires that even when actions may be justified by military necessity, the expected harm caused to civilians by those actions must not be excessive when compared against the expected gain by conducting the actions. Finally, the principle of distinction requires armed forces to distinguish between the enemy forces and the civilian population and only conduct attacks against the enemy forces. Collectively, these fundamental principles both recognize that violence is a natural part of armed conflict while working to minimize its devastating impact on both soldiers and civilians. The principle of military necessity allows parties to an armed conflict to use those measures not forbidden by international law, which are indispensable for securing the complete submission of the enemy as soon as possible. Put another way, military necessity recognizes violence will be necessary to bring about the end of an armed conflict as quickly as possible, but maintains certain weapons and tactics are so bad they will not be allowed. Let's take a moment to look at this definition in depth. Military necessity has four elements. First, violence and destruction in war is allowed. This means that the killing, injuring, and capturing of people and destruction of property is permissible. Of course, the definition doesn't stop here, or conflict would still be as brutal as it was in the Middle Ages. There are three more elements that also must be met for military necessity. The second element is that the measures used are indispensable to secure the complete submission of the enemy. This element of the definition requires that the acts of violence and destruction being done are indispensable, or, put another way, necessary to the military operation. It also allows for overwhelming force to be used against an enemy and recognizes that total and unconditional surrender of the enemy is a permissible goal. The third element is, as soon as possible. This element recognizes that the longer an armed conflict lasts, the more devastating it is on the parties fighting it, and to the civilians that are affected by it. The fourth element is where humanity comes into play and is the heart and soul of the military necessity definition. It provides that acts or measures cannot be used if they are forbidden elsewhere in international law. While the first element says anything goes, it is the fourth element that says, not so fast, other parts of law must still be followed. While the first element of the definition is permissive, it is the last element that restricts. Together, they allow any means or method of warfare to be used unless that mean or method is specifically forbidden by another part of international law. To understand this principle in action, consider this example. A bridge in country A allows civilians to cross a river that divides their town. Normally, there would be no military necessity for destroying the bridge because it serves no military purpose and destroying it would not help win the conflict. However, this can change if the bridge is used for a military purpose. To illustrate this, let's change the example a little. Now there is an armed conflict ongoing between country A and country B. The army of country A is on one side of the town, and the army of country B is on the other side of the town, with the river and bridge separating them. Country A's army plans to attack country B's army by crossing the bridge. The bridge has now changed from having purely a civilian use to also having a military use. Country B can now destroy the bridge without violating the principle of military necessity, because destroying the bridge will create a military advantage for Country B by stopping Country A's attack. It is important to note, however, that before the attack on the bridge can take place, the other three fundamental principles of IHL must also be met. While the principle of military necessity does justify violence and destruction in armed conflicts, it does not allow armed forces to doing whatever it takes to win. Military necessity never justifies violations of other provisions of IHL. Produced by the American Red Cross. If you have any questions, please contact ihlaw@redcross.org.